باب المدينة وحامي نبينا، باب المدينة وحامي نبينا. علي 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 منهج، علي تلهج باسمك املاك السماء، علي صولة وعلي جولة، علي بتار ودماء، علي سجدة على خده للعلي دمعة همة، علي غيرة وعلي غيرة من كفول فاطمة.
Assalamu alaikum. You know, it says in the Quran that if somebody from Mecca who wasn't a Muslim says Assalamu alaikum, you're supposed to nevertheless respond. So this shows you that Assalamu alaikum is universal, because the people in Mecca who weren't Muslims were saying it too. And some of the Muslims were kind of now wondering, well, should we respond? And the Quran says yes. So let me hear it louder. Thank you. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. Thanks so much for the kind invitation. I know of UMAA's work and I admire the organization. It's great of you all to give your time to it this weekend. I have a charge here to talk a little bit about, as an academic, obviously as somebody from outside the community, but to talk a little bit about what I see as the situation of the community and its challenges, especially here in an American context. So next slide, please. There's one before that. Sorry. Yes. So one of the things that I always tell my audiences to remember is that the United States is a society of immigrants. Everybody, including the Native Americans, has come here from someplace else. The natives came a long time ago. But nevertheless, we're all immigrants in this part of the world. And there is a trope in American society as a result of being an immigrant society that the people who've been here, you know, a year or two start looking down their noses at the ones who just got off the boat. There's a configuration of people as immigrants and as Native Americans or as genuine Americans or as longtime Americans or something. And one of the things that can happen many times is that historical injustices are done this way. So there's a group of people known as Californios. Most of you have seen Zorro, right? Zorro is about a hero who is a Californio. And the Californios were the old Hidalgo, the aristocrats of the Spanish Empire who were in California in the early modern period. And then when the Americans took California and incorporated it into the United States, the California stayed, and they were landlords and they were very substantial people. Over time, the white people who came in from Kansas and so forth started looking upon the Californios as Mexicans, as recent immigrants. And there's nothing that will make a Californio more angry than to be confused with a recent immigrant from Mexico. And from the point of view of the Californios, they've been here all along. It's the people from Kansas who are the immigrants. So the same thing is true with regard to the Muslim Americans, is that they're often now configured in public discourse in the United States as an immigrant community. And of course, you know, this is not untrue. But what's not recognized is that the history of Islam in North America is very old, and certainly much older than most of the people who are talking about it. But it's hidden. It's something that we historians can't get out very easily. But the fact that we can't get at it very easily doesn't mean it's not true. So for instance, they started bringing African slaves here in the 1600s. Well, about 10% of them were Muslim. They were being brought from Mali and Senegal and Nigeria and so forth. So if you think about all the labor that Africans did in the New World, you know, the raising of rice and other crops in North Carolina is basically their techniques. They brought them here and the white people adopted them. Or the labor they put in buildings. The Africans built the White House, African slaves. So 10% of all of that labor was Muslim labor. It was Muslim know-how. And we have a few, like there was a prince from Africa who wrote his memoir in Arabic after he had been kidnapped and brought here. So the history of Islam in the United States is contiguous with the history of African slavery in the United States, which is very old. And then from the other side, you know, the typical narrative of American history is often told from the point of view of English people who landed in Massachusetts. But of course, there were other populations that became, you know, central to American history, including the Latinos. And we know that Spain was Muslim and largely Berber and Arab. And when the Reconquista happened under the Castilians and finally succeeded in 1492, initially there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of Muslims who remained in Spain. And they were forced by the Inquisition to convert to Catholicism. Many of them did a pro forma conversion. So, you know, they would go to Mass on Sunday, but then they would, if you mentioned the Prophet Muhammad, they would say, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And they had to hide this from the Inquisition. So they were secret Muslims. And there were thousands of them in Spain. And then, after about 100 years, they expelled those too, and they made it difficult. Many of these Muslims who, they were called Moriscos, who were in Spain, had to go to Algeria or Morocco or even Istanbul. But large numbers of them went to Seville and got on ships and came to the New World. And in the New World, you know, the Inquisition wasn't as powerful and they had more freedom. So we don't know the history of this, but there were thousands and thousands of Latino Muslims in places like New Mexico and Mexico itself and so forth in the early modern period. So there's a hidden history of Islam in the United States, and while it's very difficult to get at, some of it can be gotten at through texts and so forth. But also, I think increasingly with regard to the Latino population, we might be able to do some genetic history. So next slide, please. So that's my first point, which is Islam actually has a prehistory that's in the United States that's much older even than the United States, and which is often now forgotten about. And then the next big period of Muslim advent in the United States was in the Gilded Age, you know, from about 1880, maybe a little bit before, until 1924. There was an enormous wave of immigration to the United States. 20 million people came at a time when, you know, in 1900 the population of the whole country was only 100 million. So this was huge, and among the immigrants in this period were what we would now call Lebanese and Syrians. And about 10% of those who came were Muslim, and some proportion of those in turn were Shia. Then there were also the beginnings then of South Asian immigration in the United States, and a few of those were Muslims and Shia. So because of this wave of immigration, you get the first purposed standalone mosque in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. There were lots of little storefront mosques and new buildings that were used for praying and so forth. But the first building that was built as a mosque and continued to exist for a long time was that in Cedar Rapids. And the Alsi family, who was very central in building that mosque, were Lebanese Shia. So the Shia were very important also in this wave of immigration. Next slide, please. Then in 1924, as a result of that huge wave of immigration to the United States, which included, you know, Italians and Jews and people that the Protestant elite were very suspicious of and nervous about, and Poles, and many of them were socialists. They had Marxist tendencies, or they were anarchists. So in 1924, the United States changed the immigration laws, and they instituted racist immigration laws. They made quotas for each country. So as many Norwegians could come as liked, but all of a sudden only 400 Syrians could come a year. So in the period I was growing up, when I was a kid in the 50s, America had become very monochrome in a way because of the immigration laws favoring only Northern Europeans. And it was a time of Jim Crow in the South. It was a very racist time. But then in the 50s and 60s, you had the Civil Rights Movement. In 1965, they were finally embarrassed by these racist laws. And they changed the law, and they said each country in the world has an upper limit of 25,000 immigrants who could legally come. So they made every country equal in this regard. And this 1965 law kicked off a whole new wave of immigration in the United States, about half of which was Latino, but the rest was Africa and Asia. And it is the result of this wave of immigration since 1965 that the American Muslim community has grown so large. Sociologists estimate in 1965, when this law was passed, probably there were only about 100,000 Muslims in the United States. And a small proportion of those were white converts. Many of them had Lebanese or other regional antecedents. But after 65, then you had this huge, another huge wave of immigration. And so you get to the point where there are millions. How many million is controversial, but millions of Muslims in the United States. And the Shiites amongst them, in the world as a whole, social statistics of this sort are hard to come by because, nobody has ever counted the Afghans, and probably it would be dangerous to try. So we don't know exactly, but something like 10 to 15% of the world's Muslims are Shiite, and probably in the United States it's on the upper side of that. As it says, likely seems to me that 15% are Shiite in the United States. Much immigration to the United States, especially by Shiites, was what immigration specialists call push migration. That is to say, you can come to the United States because you have ambitions to be a great physician or entrepreneur, and you think that the U.S. is a place where your talents can shine. And so that draws people. That's pull immigration. But then you can also come to the United States because there's a war in your country and you're escaping. And so a lot of Shiite immigration in the United States was push immigration. There was a lot of trouble in Iraq, especially for the Shia, and a lot of people came after 91. I know some of the families. Everybody lost family members at that time. People came from Iran. Not all the ones who came from Iran were particularly religious. There was a big Shiite immigration, at least with regard to heritage. Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Pakistan have all seen a lot of trouble. So a lot of the Shiites who came to the United States are classic Americans, because what was the United States, what was the myth of Plymouth Rock, was the Puritans fleeing religious persecution by the Anglican Church back in England. So wear that as a badge of honor, those of you to whom it applies. Next slide, please. Some of the push migration came because, and especially in recent decades, because of a rise of anti-Shiite politics in the region, which is complicated and differs from country to country. In Pakistan, Pakistan as a country was founded in 1947, not as a theocracy. And indeed, the founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was, by the way, a Shiite. He was from an Ismaili family, but he converted later in life, because he had very bad relations with the Aga Khan, to Twelver Shiism, at least pro forma. I don't think he was that interested in religion, to tell you the truth, but in any case, formally speaking, he was a Shiite. And Pakistan was founded not as a theocracy, and Jinnah said this. He said, it's a refuge for the Muslims of South Asia, because they were afraid of hardline Hindu domination once the British left. And so there's been a fight inside Pakistan in the 20th century and into the 21st between people who have a more tolerant, secular point of view on what Pakistan is, and many of them are religious people, and people who see Pakistan as an ideological state and who want to take it in the direction of a very rigid and hard-line vision of Islamic society. So you have groups like the Taliban now, or their radical groups like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. And some of these groups have a very hard line against Shiite Islam, against Sufi Islam, against the Christians, so that, as I said, they have a very rigid ideological vision of what Pakistan is, which is not true to the vision of the founders of the country, but also doesn't accord with how most Pakistanis view things. I mean, most Pakistanis are not particularly rigid with regard to the religious views, and there are intermarriages between Sunnis and Shiites, and there are lots of social occasions, and political parties are mixed, and so forth. So but those groups that have this very rigid and intolerant view of what Pakistan should be also seem to have access to C4 high explosives. So although they're small, I wouldn't estimate that there are more than 20,000 Taliban in northern Pakistan. And the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and groups like that, again, they're a fringe. They're like our Ku Klux Klan in the United States. But they're fiendishly clever in blowing things up and attacking people. And so they've committed assassinations of a whole string of Shiite notables in Pakistan, including physicians. Some of the origins of these feelings have to do with the class structure of Pakistan. In Jhang, for instance, the Shiites tend to be big landlords, and the small town Sunnis felt oppressed by them. And some of the origins of this, are not really in Sunnism or in Shiism so much as in social arrangements. But it's spun out of control in Pakistan, and now, of course, it's bothering the whole society. It's not just the Shiites that are in the side. So this is a big problem, and it's a problem that Pakistan has to solve if it's going to amount to anything, quite frankly, because you can't get foreign investment if Karachi is being blown up every time there's a Shiite procession. In Iraq, the American invasion, I apologize to you all about that. I'm sorry that the United States did that to Iraq. I lobbied against it myself. But the United States overthrew the government, it collapsed, and then there was a power vacuum. And in a power vacuum, people tried to mobilize all kinds of identities in order to get political power and wealth. And so Iraqis, if you go back and read the newspapers in Iraq in 1960, 1961, there's nothing in them about Sunni and Shia. It wasn't what people were fighting about. They were fighting about other things. There were articles about peasants, attacking landlords. Or there was an article about the danger of communism. We forget now, Iraq was painted in the Cold War as a radical state, as too secular. So now, once the government was overthrown, some religious people, some people who are using religion have mobilized it for political purposes, and some of them have resorted to terror. So you have the rise of something called the Islamic State of Iraq. They used to say the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialists. That beautiful building, by the way, is in Tempe, Arizona. Next slide. Well, as the Muslim American community has grown in numbers, in organization, in visibility from all of this mosque and community center building and so forth, it's also faced problems. And the problems that it's facing, I regret to tell you, are not new in American history. So if you go back to the turn of the century, of the 20th century, and read about what Protestant op-ed writers were writing in the newspapers about the Polish immigrants. They were describing them as brutish and backward and barbarian, and they were secretly, in favor of a Catholic theocracy, and they were at the same time Marxists. People would mix all these things up in their heads, and they were dangerous to the Republic, and they would never be proper Americans. And when I was growing up, it still was common that Protestant Americans told Polish jokes. They tried to make them look stupid and so forth. But over time, once a community becomes established in the United States, it changes its status so that those kinds of things are less and less often said about it. And then the community gets to have businessmen and lawyers, and it becomes dangerous to say those things about it. So the Muslims now are getting that treatment that was given the Poles and some other, the Irish and other communities that came in the 19th and early 20th century, big wave of immigration. We have the phenomenon of what some have called Islamophobia. I don't really like that word. It means the irrational fear of Islam. I think what it really is hatred of Muslims, and it's bigotry is what it is. But we see it now in our politics. I'm very suspicious about the rhythm of this Islamophobia. You know, it breaks out every 2 years, around the time that there's an election. Did you notice this? There was a wave of it in 2006, 2008, 2010. The controversy over the New York Community Center was 2010. And Rick Blasio, who was running for governor, was using that politically. And then you get it in 2012 with Romney's statements. And some of the candidates for the standard bearer of the GOP said the most outrageous things about Islam and Muslims. So I think it's really instrumental. Islamophobia has become part of American politics, and I think what's happened is that the Republicans used to win elections in the United States by running against the communists. Now, there were only ever 50,000 communists in the United States, but apparently, if you ran against them, you could win elections. So Dick Nixon became a congressman for the first time by running against communism. And this worked for them all through the Cold War. Then, unfortunately for them, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and nobody took seriously the communist threat anymore, and the American people, you know, elected a Democrat to the White House for the first time in a long time, Bill Clinton. And I think the Republican scaremongers were really quite disturbed that they had lost communism. So I can't tell you how happy they were when they discovered Islam, because then they could just use it the same way that they had used communism. And you can see it in their techniques. So one of the things they're doing is they try to make the Sharia of Islam, Islamic law, the equivalent of the Communist Manifesto. And this way of doing things allows them not to have any new thoughts, because they could just take all the old 1955 pamphlets that they wrote against the Communist Manifesto and just change Manifesto to Sharia, and they could just go on with the same thing. So the Oklahoma legislature actually tried to pass a law. Of course, it's unconstitutional that Sharia can be resorted to by American judges, since Sharia, you know, discourages murder and theft. I actually think it's a good thing if the judges refer to it, but the Oklahoma legislature wants to prevent that. And then, you know, some of the evangelical preachers, some of the Israel lobbies, they put out these outrageous statements about Muslims. Very typically what they'll do is take Surat Anfal, which is about, you know, the wars between Muslim Medina and Mecca, when the Meccans were trying to genocide the Muslims. And the Quran says, you know, kill them wherever you find them. Well, I guess so. They were trying to kill the Muslims. But these polemicists will take this verse out of context, not as a matter of self-defense, and say, well, Muslims are being commanded to go out and just murder random people. And then there's been a movement to try to restrict the building of mosques. Again, this is not new in American history. There were movements to restrict the building of Roman Catholic cathedrals. And in fact, in the Know Nothing movement of the 1840s, Catholic churches were burned down in Philadelphia by fanatical Protestants. So, you know, the United States has a long history of intolerance, and when you came here, you got involved with us, so now you're in the same boat. But I think the main thing is that Islamophobia has become brought up with American electoral politics. I think it's a very temporary thing because, you know, in some constituencies, Republicans are going to want Muslim votes. And in fact, you can see this in New York, where 800,000 Muslims live in New York. And so you see Mayor Bloomberg often will take the Muslim side because he wants their votes. And this is not maybe, you know, he's maybe a good guy and he would do this anyway, but I think there's maybe a calculation there too. Next slide. Internally, you know, that's an external challenge. Internally, all immigrant groups in U.S. history, you know, have faced certain problems. How far do you go in becoming an American? This is a question for American Roman Catholics. The Pope says you're not allowed to use birth control. American society is all about birth control. So how far do you go? Every community, every individual has to make this decision how to navigate between the inherited values of one's religious community and living in, frankly, a secular consumer society. And so that's an internal challenge for the Muslim Americans and for Shiite Muslims. And you know, there are two poles to this. One is to go whole hog and just completely assimilate and give up whatever tradition one had. Another one is to become very isolated and, you know, become like the Amish and kind of close out American society, not have telephones and so forth. And both of those strategies are adopted by people over time. Then there are issues in self-definition. You know, the Shiite community itself, it's got Iraqis, it's got Pakistanis, you know, how active are the Ismailis among the Ash'aris, and then the question of the relationship of Shiism to the Sunni majority. But most successful immigrant groups have managed to strike this balance. I don't pretend to tell anybody which balance to strike. But I can say, if you look in the history of America, what groups have managed to retain a certain amount of their own identity and yet have flourished in this country, become powerful and wealthy and influential and so forth, they have struck that balance. So I think that's the key thing. And it can be done. You know, the United States system has many drawbacks, but it is a system in which talent rises to the top, and in which at least a discourse of tolerance is promoted. So there's something called a civic religion in the United States, that when politicians speak publicly, they tend to talk about God rather than about, you know, Judaism or Christianity and so forth. And there's no reason why Islam can't be inducted into that tradition of civic religion. In fact, you can see it already happening, the president having iftar dinners and so forth. Next slide, please. So, if we look out at how the community has been dealing with these various challenges, one thing you can see in the community is a certain amount of outreach. Polling, by the way, of Islamophobic views among Americans shows that where an American respondent to one of these polls says that they know a Muslim individual, they have a more favorable view of Islam. So ignorance of the community, not knowing anybody in it, promotes fanaticism and negative feelings. So you see a lot of Muslim communities are trying to involve outsiders. I even talked to a peace group in Texas, and I initially got this invitation from a peace group. When I got there, I discovered that it was a group of mosques, and they were a peace group. They had made an alliance with the Quakers and with others, and of course they were against the wars, so it made perfect sense, but they didn't advertise themselves as a Muslim peace group. They advertised themselves as a peace group, even though the vast majority of the members seemed to be Muslim. So this was a form of outreach and making an alliance with Americans interested in peace. There's been a lot of Muslim engagement in interfaith dialogue. A lot of churches like to get together people from different religions and maybe have a reading group or a discussion. You know, I have encountered, and I've been told by Muslims who have encountered a mindset where, well, but you shouldn't step foot in a church if you're a pious Muslim. Well, actually, I don't know, as a historian, of any textual basis for such an attitude in Islam. If somebody has that attitude, I can't argue with them, but let's just say that that attitude is not helpful to mainstreaming the community in order to be successful in the United States. And I know of an instance where a church offered a Muslim community to let it use its facilities on Friday for services, and there was opposition to doing that in the community. So there are choices to be made here, but I think you can see efforts at outreach. Then there has to be a voice. You know, not enough Muslim Americans, young Muslim Americans, are becoming journalists and academics and people who write and who are in public and who are articulate. And I understand the impetus to succeed and to have the children all be engineers, dentists, physicians, and lawyers. But I have to say that if you only have professions in the community, that you don't have then people who look good on CNN. You have to have somebody who's been trained to speak in public, who's been trained to reason about history and society, and journalists and academics are among them, and we need more. I would be very happy if my successor in this chair at the University of Michigan in modern Middle Eastern history were filled by a Muslim American. There's no reason why not. But at the moment, there aren't enough, I think, young people doing that, and the parents have to encourage at least a few of them to go in that direction. Next slide, please. And then there are political responses. We've seen engagement in politics. A lot of Muslim Americans, especially after 9/11, were afraid to stick their heads up, thought it was better just to be quiet. I couldn't disagree more, and you see, we have in the audience people like Sayyid Hassan Qazwini and Salam Mariyati, who have put themselves on the line by being public, and this is really, it seems to be very important. And then getting involved in politics. I don't care which party you support, the Greens, the Republicans, the Democrats, it's not important, but people should be involved in politics. The United States is a society which says it's a democracy, but it's not an automatic democracy. It's not like in Australia where if you don't vote, they think that's weird and they fine you. In America, oh, don't vote, nobody cares. But if you don't vote, then nobody will care what you think. The politicians are looking for votes. If you regularly don't vote, then you're not part of the democracy. You might as well be living in Bulgaria if you don't vote. You not only have to vote, but then you have to go to their offices and sit in them and say, I voted for you, and your policies on this issue don't please me. You have to make yourself known to them. So there needs to be more of that, and of course, there have been Muslim Americans. We have 2 Muslim Americans in Congress now. Keith Ellison is very prominent in this regard. We need more. And you can say, well, the Muslim Americans are a small community, you can't expect them to have more. There are lots of communities in the United States who are very small, who have disproportionate representation in politics. So be like them. I think a certain amount of self-defense is necessary given this atmosphere of intolerance and Islamophobia. And so you have the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, which hires lawyers to defend Muslim Americans or Arab Americans when they are discriminated against in the workplace. And the more of that there is, the better, because the United States works by property. John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, their idea of what a democracy was it was rooted in property. And so where a tort can be shown to be committed against somebody, then the system will work for you. And finally, you see a great deal of ecumenical Muslim activism, as I said, involvement in interfaith dialogue, but also across Sunni and Shiite barriers in this organization and in Salam's organization of Impact and in others. And I think that's all to the good. So the challenges are great, but this is a magnificent moment. The United States is a tapestry. It's like a Persian rug. It has all kinds of colorful threads woven through it, and the threads, if you stand back, you can see that they make a beautiful picture. And so the Shiite Americans are now weaving one more thread into this tapestry, and you know when the carpet is really good, it's double knotted. So it's only when everybody pitches in that you get the really beautiful double knotted carpet, and that's the contribution that the Shiite Americans now can make to our country. Thank you so much.